Mara Ellis had built a career on noticing edges, the crease of a sleeve when a performer exhaled, the brief looseness of a jaw the instant a spotlight turned away. After 10 years as a music photographer, she'd learned to be a shadow at the party, present but quiet, sharp but careful. Her social media was minimal by design. Portraits, tour stills, the occasional film black image that said more with light than words. She liked it that way. The world could have its noise. Mara kept hers small and deliberate. When Cass Marlow walked into a warehouse shoot one autumn evening, everything she thought she knew about containment shifted. Cass moved as if she had music in her bones even when she wasn't singing, a taut, dangerous grace that folded into a grin when nobody was looking. She wore an old army jacket over a dress that looked like it had survived 3 lifetimes. Her hair fell in waves that caught the light. She didn't smile often, but when she did, it rearranged the room. "Are you Mara?" Her voice was low and laced with something like practiced sincerity. "Or do you prefer Ms. Ellis when I'm charming you?" Mara didn't look up from the lens. "Stand where the light is good," she said, because that was the work. "Don't check." She stopped herself and let it go. The second Cass moved, the lens answered. Cass followed direction like she'd studied it in secret. She listened, adjusted subtly, and when the music on the set shifted to a slower, raw track, something in her relaxed, a private opening that Mara caught in 100 frames. After the last flash, Cass plucked her phone from the back pocket of her jeans with a small frown. It vibrated again and again. "I'll make you a deal," Cass said, turning to Mara. "Be my fake girlfriend for one night. My ex is coming to the launch party. I need someone who won't scream or post." She squared her shoulders like it was business. "Payment negotiable. Either cash or credit on the next tour's photo pass. Or both." Mara's instinct was professional refusal. She did not blur lines with clients. She did not become part of a story. But Cass's eyes were the color of the streetlights that come on before midnight, warm and too honest. And she had a Joker of Hearts grin that, for reasons Mara could not name, felt like a dare. One night, Mara said, "No touching. And no social stuff. No posts. I don't do drama." Cass offered a theatrical bow. "Deal. But only if you can stand fake public affection without turning it into an editorial." Mara thought of safety, of rules, of the clean boundary between subject and shooter. In the end, she said yes. The party was a warm, sticky blur of champagne and rumors. Cass wound her way through it like a comet, and when her ex swept into the room with the painted confidence of someone used to ownership, Cass turned and linked her hand through Mara's elbow like they'd been rehearsing the movement. The ex narrowed her eyes and then, perhaps satisfied or perhaps intimidated, retreated into the crowd. "What did you do?" Mara asked later in the cab, half laughing. The city lights stuttered across Cass's profile. "I made a small theater debut," Cass said. "You were excellent. Cold, controlled, impossibly boring." She flicked a grin. "Want to come to Santa Vera? The label wants some portraits and the show's tomorrow. I'd like, if you're not busy, to have you there. For real this time." Mara agreed with a rational voice in her head warning of careers and tastes and the slippery slope of proximity. But another part of her, the part that liked quiet moments and found comfort in observation, wanted to see the truth behind the stage light. "Fine," she said. "One weekend. No social. And one room each." Cass's hand found Mara's before the words were done, as casual as a habit. "I'll buy you coffee the way you like it," she said. "And maybe I'll let you take the pictures I don't let anyone else see." The first night in Santa Vera, Cass was a different animal, a singer who could rip the roof off with a single held note, yet on stage vulnerable in the way of people who know their own edges. Mara photographed with the kind of careful hunger that borders on reverence. Cass sang like the world outran her, and she was trying to catch it. Backstage after the set, Cass grabbed Mara's wrist and led her up to a rooftop where the air was thin and salted with surf. "You see it?" she asked, thrusting the cigarette light into the dark like a match for confessions. "You look tired," Mara said instead, because she was a cataloger of truths, not a dealer in illusions. Cass blew a smoke ring, watched it hang, and then smiled without humor. "I am. But I like that you notice." The first kiss happened there, not a sudden feverish thing but a soft, experimental lock of lips that began as curiosity and burned into wanting. Cass's thumb traced Mara's jaw. Mara's camera dangled against her hip, momentarily forgotten. They left their cameras in the van. There was no need for documentation in that specific, dim hour. Words came later, often clumsy and true. Cass spoke of small things, an old songbox she kept in the van, the taste of hotel coffee, the first time she wrote a chorus that made her cry, and Mara listened, finding quality in the mundane confessions. She made photos with new tenderness, capturing angles of Cass no PR person would approve of, a toe tapping in the green room, a laugh caught with eyes closed, hair clinging damp to her collar after a hard performance. They slept in separate rooms the first night, and the distance between them tasted like possibility. By the second morning, the space had softened. Cass made eggs badly and left an origami of burnt toast on Mara's plate like a peace offering. Mara found herself letting the world in like it had a hand on the other side of a closed door. On the third night, they shared a bed. It was a quiet gentleness that unlatched more than Mara expected. Cass traced shapes along the inside of Mara's forearm in the dark. Mara memorized the slope of Cass's collarbone by touch. Kisses multiplied, a trailing map across cheeks and shoulders, and every one of them erased a little of Mara's old rules. "You said no touching without asking," Cass murmured once in the half-light, teasing and sincere. "You said you'd respect me," Mara replied. "I'm not so good at promises." "Then let me keep mine," Cass said, and she kept it for days. Photos lead to headlines faster than either of them wanted. A candid of Mara and Cass leaving a bookstore went viral, a blurry snap, a hand on a small of a back, a tilt of a head. Panic landed in Mara like a physical weight. She had built a life of anonymity by design. The next day, thousands of strangers knew her name. Cass was furious at herself. She didn't go on talk shows or make statements. She did something else. She stepped into Mara's life loudly and with intention. She showed up at Mara's apartment with flowers in one hand and a worn cassette of a song she'd written to herself in the other. "Why didn't you tell me about the pictures?" Mara asked, not soft, because privacy was an ethical thing for her, a way to survive. "I wanted to protect you," Cass said simply. "I thought if the world was slower, you would be too." But the world was not slow. The headline engines wanted a drama. Fan accounts speculated. Mara's inbox filled with strangers' opinions on her photos, on her past, on who she ought to be. She retreated, physically and digitally. Cass watched her go and felt the windows of her life crash inward. She panicked less publicly and more privately. She stopped answering calls from her manager for a while. She canceled a radio segment. Instead, she sat on the piano in the rehearsal space and pressed keys until her fingers bled small, honest notes across ivory. The rupture was a hard, hollow thing. Mara walked out of Cass's dressing room after an argument, telling Cass that she needed quiet and that if Cass was not willing to make space for it, then Mara couldn't be part of whatever this was. Cass did not chase in a public, dramatic way. Instead, she made a small, deliberate series of choices. She turned down a mid-tier festival slot that would have put a spotlight on the couple rumors. She posted one song at midnight with no announcement, a piano and voice track that began with the line, "You are not a rumor." She let the internet buzz for an afternoon and then started writing letters she did not send, and photos she did not share. When Mara finally came to the rehearsal studio on a clear, gray morning, the air between them was heavy but not irredeemable. Cass had kept some of the photos she took with her phone, Mara asleep on a couch covered in a scarf, Mara laughing at the corner of an email, Mara with flour on her knuckles from attempt to cook. It was, Cass said, a small archive of a person she wanted to remember outside of a headline. Mara stood with her fingers curled at her side and, for reasons that felt both dangerous and like gravity, she stepped in. They reconciled slowly, like suturing a wound with fine thread. Cass learned not to overshare. Mara learned to ask for help in ways that felt manageable. Trust was a muscle they had to exercise. 3 weeks later, the band asked Cass to do a short acoustic tour along the coast. It was the kind of tour that could have been a break or an exposure. Cass looked at Mara as if offering a map to the ocean. "Come with me," she said simply. I mean it this time. Full access. You'll work. I'll perform. We'll keep boundaries, but I want you there. Mara considered every rational reason not to go. Then she thought of the way Cass looked at her from stage left, like she was the only person in 100 rows whose face mattered. She packed a small bag, her cameras, her stubborn heart. She went. Life on the road was smoky and raw and tender. They swapped small routines to lubricate the daily friction. Mara photographed while Cass warmed up. Cass kept a playlist that started with songs Mara liked. They always ate the same microwave noodles at midnight and argued about the correct number of chili flakes. The world roared outside, screaming crowds, backstage lines, but inside the van, they created a tiny island of rituals. Kisses multiplied and deepened. A brief peck before Cass walked on stage. A longer, breathy kiss in the storage room after a show that smelled of beer and old cables. A kiss whispered on the cheek before sleep, then another rendition pressed against lips in the dark when neither wanted to be the first to say, I love you. The physical intimacy developed like a language of consent and hunger and soft reverence. Cass's hands learned Mara's preferred gentle touches, the small pressure that anchored her when the world felt too big. Mara learned the way Cass liked her hair tucked behind her ear before a soft kiss, how Cass marked affection by the small habitual stealing of the front seat of the van. One rainy night in Portland, the sky poured and the roof of the venue leaked, which only made the crowd a humming body of warmth. They escaped onto the venue roof after the show, rain washing everything clean. Cass pulled Mara close with 2 hands at the small of her back and kissed her like someone trying to rewrite a past mistake. Their mouths fit with that exhausted efficiency of lovers who have run out of dramatics and are instead trying, fiercely, to keep each other. We should tell people, Cass said later, teeth grazing Mara's earlobe. Mara was awake, breath shallow in the cold glow of the van's interior light. She looked at Cass, at the exhaustion traced in the lines around her eyes, at the tenderness that seemed to arrive in the edges of everything she did. Not like publicity, Mara said. Not staged. Not an announcement. I don't want to be a campaign. Then let's be private and public, Cass said. We'll let them see pieces without turning us into a product. Small words. Small signs. Mara let herself be pulled in again and again until the argument lost its wool and became touchstone. Fame is a river that finds crevices. People noticed. A fan asked Cass bluntly if Mara was her girlfriend at a signing in Seattle, and Cass answered yes, with a quiet pride that felt like a vow. The internet churned. People amplified nicknames and theories. Mara's inbox brightened and then darkened with both praise and invasive speculation. But something changed this tour, a small, steady shift from "can we" to "how will we." Cass chose Mara with gestures that required little explanation. She introduced Mara as my photographer and my favorite person at a diner interview, then internally flinched at her own openness and filed the memory under courage. Mara published a photo series titled Quiet Light, a curated collection of intimate black and white frames capturing Cass off stage, and did it without a caption. The press wanted a statement. Cass gave them a song, then refused to fight over the headline. Mara kept shooting. The last night of the run was in a city with a river the color of worn steel. The venue was the biggest yet, the crowd the loudest. Cass sat in the dressing room with a nervous energy in her hands. They offered me a tour, she said after a moment, voice thin. An international slot. A longer leg. It's everything for my career. Mara swallowed. The offer meant time gone, distance measured in flight hours and hotel sheets. It meant a life split between airports and empty bed nights. It also meant the choice they had been tiptoeing toward since the first stolen kiss. If you go, Mara said carefully, what happens to here? Cass's hand found hers and covered it with calloused warmth. We decide together. I'm not asking you to be my shadow. I'm asking you to be my partner in whatever shape that takes. Maybe sometimes you'll be in the front row, maybe sometimes you'll stay home and build the quiet. I want both. Mara thought of the cameras, the silence, the routines she loved. She thought of the nights she'd closed herself to anything that could make her vulnerable. And she thought of the way Cass looked at her not as an image to be curated, but as someone to come back to. No, she said finally. I won't be a carry-on. I won't be something you bring to make a headline look human. But I will go with you if we keep the rules we learned here. No stage statements. Nights that are just ours. Boundaries when we need them. They planned like cartographers folding a map with care. Cass negotiated a schedule where Mara had veto power on certain promotional nights. Mara agreed to take commissions and to be Mara first, partner second in public, and everything else private. They named a few red lines: no staged PR photos of them kissing, no interviews that dissected their relationship, and mutual support in times of vulnerability. On the day Cass signed the contract that made their plans possible, they stood on the roof balcony of an airless hotel. The city breathed below them in patterns of brake lights and neon. Cass took Mara's face between both hands and kissed her hard, like a promise. "I choose you," Cass said, "and no one else mattered." Mara smiled against her lips. "I know," she said, and meant it. The first months were not perfect. There were missed calls and lonely stretches, and the weight of fans and expectations creaked at the edges of their quiet. There were gaslit arguments, nights of silent treatment followed by small, tender reconciliations. Cass's schedule sometimes collapsed on them like a storm. Mara learned to hold space and to pack small comforts when she could be with Cass. They developed a new language of survival, code words for when the world got too loud, rituals for returning home. Cass carried back small tiles with song lyrics scrawled on them like talismans. Mara kept a jar of dried citrus peels that smelled like the nights they cooked together. Kisses continued to proliferate. They were both major and minor currency in the economy of their life together. A quick press before a sound check, a slow, open-mouthed claiming in a storage room, a forehead-to-forehead surrender in an airport nap pod. Their romance was unashamed of its tenderness and its hunger. Lovers who had learned how to be careful and how reckless could be, sometimes both at once. When Cass announced, privately, in the middle of a slow Tuesday morning, that she would take a short break from the major circuit to make an album that wasn't designed to sell 100,000 copies, but to say something real, Mara sat on the kitchen counter and kissed her like she was light. "Don't leave it half done," Mara teased, fingers finding the back of Cass's neck. "Make it honest." "I will," Cass promised. "I'll make it for us." They built a life in which work and love were not enemies. Mara photographed album art that had no label logo, just hand-scrawled titles and coffee rings. Cass wrote songs that started with single lines Mara had said in passing. They hosted small friends-only listening parties in which Cass performed the new tracks and Mara kept the lights low and wine glasses full. The songs were raw and imperfect, and Cass's voice fractured on the high notes with something like confession. At one such listening, Cass paused mid-song and looked straight at Mara. "This one's for you," she whispered into the mic, and Mara felt the room tilt. The opening chords were simple and the lyrics unclothed. "You keep me grounded," Cass sang, and in the chorus she repeated the phrase Mara had once written on a napkin, "Stay with me," quietly. The audience cheered. Mara felt ridiculous and incandescent. She stood and clapped in the small pressurized joy of someone who had been chosen. A year of days unfurled into a domestic rhythm. They moved into an apartment with a balcony that looked over a quieter street. Cass kept a potted rosemary that they both liked to forget to water. Mara hung a gallery wall of candid black and white photos, Cass mid-song, Cass laughing with flour on her chin, Cass asleep on a couch that had become their weekend altar. The wall was an intimacy for the public in a way that felt safe. It was also a love letter. They had a ritual on Sundays, a slow breakfast, a walk to the park, a picnic blanket, and no phones for an entire afternoon. Sometimes they'd read while the other slept, and sometimes they'd just watch the way light moved through trees. Kisses were frequent as punctuation, a seal on a sentence, a comma that turned into a new clause. On the second anniversary of the night Cass first asked Mara to be her fake girlfriend, Cass cooked a terrible dinner and left a small, folded note on Mara's plate. "Meet me on the roof," it read. Mara climbed up and found Cass standing with fairy lights coiled around her bare wrists like a crown. The city slid below them in soft hums. Cass's eyes had the sheen of withheld tears. "I asked you to be my actress once," Cass said, voice rough with everything. "You chose to be my life. I want to make an ask I mean every day. Will you move in with me for real, forever in the practical sense, not just as someone who sleeps on my couch between tours. Mara let out the breath that had been waiting in her chest since Santa Vera. She smiled and kissed Cass like a punctuation, soft and full. Later, with the city a witness, they settled into a promise that looked a lot like domesticity and a lot like continuation. There was no dramatic public proposal. They bought a new kettle instead and signed the paperwork for a longer lease. Their vows were in small things: an extra toothbrush, the decision to let go of old privacy for the safety of shared accounts, the choosing of a single mug that meant morning belonged to both of them. They made mistakes. Fame's undercurrent lurked still, with opportunistic articles and occasional invasive paparazzi. But they had learned to close ranks. When a rumor swelled, they answered it with consistency, by showing up for each other, by protecting the sacred little daily rituals that made their relationship whole. One night, after a long day of studio sessions, Cass played a new song on the piano. She had written it in the space that used to scare her, tenderness without applause. The final line was simple and not theatrical: I love you. Not for your color on my timeline. Not for the clamor you drown. I love you for the quiet you make possible. Mara closed her eyes and kissed her until the room blurred into something warm. I love you, she answered, because the truth had been furnishing itself in the space between them for months and years. They didn't need a finale. Their happy ending was a life that continued, not perfect, not untouched by the world, but deliberately chosen, again and again. They learned that love wasn't the explosive burn of a one-night story. It was the patient keeping of someone's heart when the rest of existence tried to monetize it. It was the collection of small gestures that added up to a home. On a bench in the park, years from that warehouse shoot, Mara looked at Cass and said, "Do you remember the first time you asked me to be your fake girlfriend?" Cass laughed, brushing hair behind Mara's ear with the same care she had in the early days. "Of course. I thought I could buy the quiet." "You did," Mara said. "In the end, you bought it with honesty." Cass kissed Mara then, a long, unapologetic press of lips, more kissing than was probably necessary to convey a lifetime of intention. It tasted of rosemary, of coffee, of rain. When Mara raised her camera to capture the moment, out of habit more than necessity, Cass tapped the lens and said, "Not that one. Keep this one from the world." Mara lowered the camera and kept the image inside herself, where some things are better left unshared. She kissed Cass again, because some stories are best told in the finding, not the telling. They stayed. They chose. They lived. And somewhere between song and shudder, between the stage and the breakfast counter, they built a life that was not a headline but everything they had hoped for: private, loud in its tenderness, and utterly, irrevocably theirs.